high in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers can't reach and the nearest neighbor lives 20 miles away, Martha and Henry Sullivan had built their dream retirement cabin. For 15 years, they'd lived in perfect harmony with the wilderness, until the wolf arrived. This wasn't just any wolf. Standing nearly 4 feet tall with eyes that burned like amber fire, the creature had been terrorizing their property for weeks, killing their chickens, destroying their garden, and circling their cabin each night with predatory patience. Henry's hunting rifle seemed useless against something that moved like smoke through the trees. Then came the boy. Wild-haired and barefoot, he appeared during the wolf's most vicious attack, speaking to the beast in a language that sounded older than the mountains themselves. What happened next defied everything the Sullivans thought they knew about nature, about magic, and the thin veil between our world and something far more ancient. But who was this mysterious child, and why could he command creatures that should have torn him apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Martha saw the boy, she thought she was hallucinating from exhaustion. She and Henry had been taking turns keeping watch for 3 sleepless nights, ever since the wolf had begun its nightly siege. The massive creature would emerge from the tree line just after dusk, pacing the perimeter of their property with methodical determination, testing their defenses like a general surveying a battlefield. "Henry," Martha whispered, pressing her face against the kitchen window. "There's someone out there." Her husband looked up from cleaning his rifle for the 10th time that evening. The weapon felt inadequate in his weathered hands, a child's toy against a force of nature. "Where?" "By the woodshed. It's just a kid." Henry joined her at the window, squinting into the gathering darkness. Sure enough, a small figure stood motionless near their split log pile, silhouetted against the dying light. The child couldn't have been more than 12 years old, wearing what appeared to be rough-hewn clothes that hung loose on his thin frame. "What the hell is a kid doing way up here?" Henry muttered. "Nearest family is the Hendersons, and they don't have any children." As if summoned by their attention, the wolf materialized from the shadows. It moved with liquid grace, each step deliberate and predatory. The beast was even larger than Henry remembered, a primordial thing that seemed belong to an age when dire wolves stalked the earth. Its amber eyes fixed on the boy with unmistakable hunger. Martha's hand flew to her throat. "Oh God, we have to do something." Henry was already moving toward the door, rifle in hand, but something made him pause. The boy hadn't run, he hadn't even flinched. Instead, he turned toward the approaching wolf with an eerie calmness that set Henry's nerves on edge. The wolf stopped 10 feet away, lowering its massive head in what looked almost like a bow. The boy stepped forward, his lips moving in what sounded like a conversation, though no words were audible through the cabin's walls. The language, if it was a language, seemed to flow like wind through pine needles, all whispers and sighs that somehow carried the weight of ancient authority. "This isn't possible," Martha breathed. The wolf's ears pricked forward, listening. Its tail, which had been held high with aggressive confidence, lowered slightly. The boy raised one small hand, palm outward, and the massive predator actually took a step backward. Then something shifted. The wolf's hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled across the clearing. The boy's posture changed too, becoming rigid with what looked like fear, or perhaps recognition. He spoke again, more urgently now, his child's voice carrying across the still air with surprising force. The confrontation that followed lasted only seconds, but Henry would replay it in his mind for years to come. The wolf lunged forward with explosive power, jaws agape, aiming for the boy's exposed throat. The child didn't dodge or run. Instead, he thrust both hands forward and spoke a single word that seemed to crack the very air around them. The wolf stopped mid-leap as if it had struck an invisible wall, then tumbled to the ground with a yelp of surprise and pain. It scrambled to its feet, shook itself once, and then, impossibly, whimpered like a scolded puppy. The boy spoke again, softer this time, and the massive creature turned and melted back into the forest without a backward glance. In the sudden silence that followed, the boy stood alone in their clearing, shoulders sagging with exhaustion. He swayed on his feet for a moment, then collapsed to his knees in the dirt. "Henry," Martha said urgently, "we need to help him." But when they rushed outside, they found only disturbed earth where the boy had fallen. Footprints led away into the darkness, small, bare human feet alongside the massive paw prints of the wolf, heading deeper into the mountains as if they were traveling companions rather than enemies. The siege was over, but somehow Henry knew their real troubles were just beginning. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like gossamer threads, reluctant to surrender to the climbing sun. Eleanor stirred the porridge with mechanical precision, her weathered hands steady despite the tremor of unease that had taken root in her chest. Through the kitchen window, she could see Matthias bent over the broken gate, his grizzled beard catching dewdrops as he worked to repair the damage from the night before. Neither had spoken much since dawn. What words could encompass what they had witnessed? The enormous wolf, black as a moonless night, had materialized from the forest like something torn from an old wives' tale. Its eyes had burned with an intelligence that chilled Eleanor more than its size or the gleaming fangs that could have snapped a man's spine like kindling. But it was the boy who haunted her thoughts most. Where had he come from? In their 40 years on this remote mountain, she and Matthias had seen perhaps a dozen strangers pass through, and never a child traveling alone. Yet there he had been, emerging from the darkness with bare feet and clothes that hung on his slight frame like borrowed shadows. The porridge began to bubble, pulling Eleanor from her reverie. She lifted the pot from the heat and ladled 2 portions into wooden bowls, then hesitated. Through the window she could see no sign of the boy. Perhaps he had simply melted back into the wilderness as suddenly as he had appeared. But something told her he remained nearby, watching from the tree line with those unsettling amber eyes. She added a 3rd serving to a bowl and stepped outside. "Any tracks?" she called to Matthias, who looked up from his work with wire and wood. "Wolf prints, large as dinner plates," he replied, straightening with a grunt. They circle the cabin twice, then head back toward the high country. But strange thing, they disappear completely near the old oak grove, like the beast just vanished into thin air. Eleanor nodded, though the information settled uneasily in her stomach. She set the extra bowl on the porch railing and retreated inside, positioning herself where she could observe through the window without being seen. They didn't have to wait long. The boy materialized from between the pine trees with a silence that seemed unnatural. No snapping twigs announced his approach, no rustle of disturbed undergrowth. One moment the forest stood empty, the next he was there, crouched at the edge of their small clearing with his head tilted like a wild creature testing the wind. Matthias looked up from the gate and froze. The boy straightened slowly, and Eleanor could see the wariness in his posture, the way he balanced on the balls of his feet as if ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But hunger won over caution. He approached the porch with careful steps, keeping his strange golden eyes fixed on Matthias. The porridge disappeared in moments, the boy eating with his hands and licking the bowl clean with an efficiency that spoke of too many empty days. When he finished, he set the bowl down carefully and looked directly at the window where Eleanor stood watching. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the glass. It was the first time she had heard him speak, and the sound sent an odd chill down her spine. His words were perfectly pronounced, almost formal, yet there was something underneath, a wildness that no amount of civilized speech could mask. Matthias approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "What's your name, boy?" The child considered this for a long moment, as if the question required careful thought. "Kieran," he said finally. "Where are your parents, Kieran? Your family?" Another pause. "Gone." The single word carried such finality that Matthias glanced toward the window where he knew Eleanor watched. They had raised no children of their own, had grown comfortable in their solitude, but the boy's obvious need stirred something protective in both their hearts. "How did you, last night, with the wolf?" Matthias struggled to frame the question that had been burning in his mind since dawn. Kieran's expression shifted, became shuttered and distant. "Some things understand only strength," he said. I spoke to it in a language it knew. The explanation explained nothing, yet something in the boy's tone discouraged further questions. Eleanor watched as he stood and backed toward the forest edge, his movements flowing with an odd predatory grace. "Will we see you again?" Matthias called. Kieran paused at the tree line. "The wolf will return," he said simply. "When the moon grows full again, it will come back hungrier than before. You cannot stop what drives it." "And you can?" The boy's smile was brief and sharp. "I am what drives it." Before Matthias could respond, Kieran melted back into the forest, leaving only questions and the lingering sense that their quiet mountain life had irrevocably changed. The boy's eyes never left the massive wolf as it circled their cabin like a predator sizing up its prey. Martha clutched Edwin's weathered hand, both of them pressed against the window, watching in stunned silence as the strange child, who had appeared from nowhere, stood his ground in their front yard. "We have to help him," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to howl through the pines. "With what?" Edwin's grip tightened on her fingers. "That beast would tear us apart before we made it 3 steps." The wolf's hackles rose higher, its massive frame casting an impossible shadow in the moonlight. It had to weigh more than both horses combined, its shoulders reaching nearly to the boy's chest. Yet the child showed no fear, his bare feet planted firmly in the frost-covered grass, arms hanging loose at his sides. Martha noticed something odd about the boy's posture. There was something almost familiar in the way he held himself, the slight forward lean of his torso, the way his fingers curved as if ready to grasp, like an animal preparing to strike. The wolf let out a low rumble that vibrated through the cabin walls, making the glass panes rattle in their frames. Edwin felt Martha's sharp intake of breath as the beast's lips pulled back, revealing teeth like ivory daggers. But instead of cowering, the boy tilted his head, mimicking the wolf's movement with unsettling precision. "Dear God," Martha breathed. "Look at his eyes." Even from their position at the window, they could see the change. The boy's eyes had begun to emit a faint luminescence, not unlike the cold fire that burned in the wolf's gaze. The air between them seemed to shimmer, as if some invisible force was building. The wolf stopped circling and fixed its attention fully on the boy. For a moment, the night fell absolutely still. Even the wind died away, leaving only the soft whisper of settling snow and the rapid beating of Martha's heart. Then the boy spoke, though the words weren't in any language Edwin or Martha recognized. The sounds were guttural, primal, like the communication between pack animals. The wolf's ears swiveled forward, its massive head tilting in response. "He's talking to it," Edwin said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. The exchange continued, a series of growls, whines, and strange clicking sounds that seemed to flow naturally from the boy's throat. With each vocalization, his eyes grew brighter, and Martha could swear she saw something shifting beneath his pale skin, as if muscles and bones were rearranging themselves. The wolf took a step backward, then another. Its ears flattened against its skull, and for the first time since it had emerged from the forest, uncertainty flickered in its ancient eyes. The boy pressed his advantage, moving forward with a fluid grace that was distinctly non-human. Edwin had spent 60 years in these mountains, had tracked and hunted every manner of creature, from black bears to mountain lions. He understood predator behavior, recognized the subtle signs of dominance and submission that played out in the wild. What he was witnessing now followed those same primal rules, but with the impossible twist that one of the participants appeared to be a human child. The boy raised his hand, and Martha gasped. His fingers had elongated, ending in what looked unmistakably like claws that caught the moonlight. When he opened his mouth to emit another series of sounds, they glimpsed teeth that were far too sharp, too numerous for any human jaw. The massive wolf whimpered, actually whimpered, and lowered its great head in a gesture of submission. The boy approached slowly, each step deliberate and measured. When he reached the beast, he extended one transformed hand and placed it on the wolf's broad forehead. The contact lasted only seconds, but in that brief moment, Both creatures seemed to glow with the same ethereal light. Then the wolf turned and padded back into the forest, its departure as silent and swift as its arrival had been terrifying. The boy watched until the creature vanished completely among the trees. Then, as if a spell had been broken, he swayed on his feet and collapsed to his knees in their yard. The unnatural light faded from his eyes, and his hands returned to their human form, though Martha noticed they were now bleeding from several deep scratches. "Edwin," she said, already moving toward the door. "Martha, no. We don't know what he is." She paused, her hand on the latch, torn between fear and compassion. The boy had just saved their lives, possibly their entire homestead. But the display of power they had witnessed raised questions that chilled her more than the mountain wind. In the yard, the child struggled to push himself upright, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. He looked toward their cabin, and even in his weakened state, Martha could see an intelligence in his gaze that was far older than his apparent years. Whatever he was, human or something else entirely, he was just a child who needed help. She opened the door. The boy's fever broke on the third day, but Ilara wished it hadn't. When consciousness returned to those amber eyes, something wild and untamed flickered behind them, something that made her ancient shepherd dog whimper and retreat to the farthest corner of the cabin. The child sat up slowly, his gaze sweeping the small room with the calculated wariness of a predator assessing new territory. "You're safe," Ilara said softly, setting down her knitting. "You've been ill." The boy's head tilted at an unnatural angle, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard a low growl rumble in his chest. Then his features softened, and he seemed to remember how to be human again. "Where am I?" His voice carried an odd cadence, as if speaking were a skill recently relearned. "Our home, in the Thornspine Mountains." She gestured toward the window where grey peaks pierced the morning sky. "My husband Magnus found you in the forest. Do you remember how you came to be there?" The boy's brow furrowed, and his hands clenched the woolen blanket. "I remember running, always running." His amber eyes grew distant. "The pack called, but I couldn't answer. Not anymore." Ilara's blood chilled. Pack. The word hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Magnus chose that moment to return from checking their traps, his heavy boots announcing his arrival. The boy's reaction was immediate and startling. His body went rigid, nostrils flaring as if scenting the air. Only when Magnus appeared in the doorway, hands visible and empty of weapons, did the tension ease from the child's shoulders. "Good to see you awake, lad." Magnus pulled off his wool cap, releasing a cloud of grey hair. "Gave us quite a scare." "Magnus," Ilara said carefully, "perhaps you should know that our young friend here speaks of a pack." The old man's weathered face grew serious. He'd heard the howls, too, growing closer each night. The massive tracks he'd found near their chicken coop, the way their livestock huddled together, trembling with an ancient fear. "What manner of pack?" Magnus asked, settling into his chair by the fire. The boy's eyes darted between them, as if weighing how much truth they could bear. "The kind that kills without mercy, the kind that grows hungrier with each moon." He paused, his young face bearing an expression far too old for his years. "The kind led by something that was once like me." Ilara's knitting needles stilled in her hands. "Like you?" "I wasn't always." The boy struggled for words, his hands gesturing helplessly. "The change came when I was smaller, a bite, fever, dreams of hunting under starlight." He looked down at his palms as if seeing claws instead of fingers. "But I fought it, held on to the parts that remembered being human. Others let themselves fall completely." Magnus leaned forward, his voice gentle but urgent. "This pack, how many?" "7, when I left them." The boy's amber eyes held a haunted quality. "But Fenris can turn more. He delights in it, takes children from villages, gives them the choice I was given. Most choose the freedom of the hunt over the burden of conscience." "Fenris," Ilara whispered. Ancient stories stirred in her memory. Tales her grandmother had told of creatures that walked the line between man and wolf, bringing doom to mountain settlements. Their Alpha. Once, he might have been someone's son, someone's brother. Now he's something else entirely, something that remembers just enough of humanity to hate it. The boy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He knows I'm here, can smell my defiance on the wind. That's why the pack draws closer each night. Magnus and Alara exchanged glances heavy with understanding. Their quiet mountain life, their simple routines of survival and contentment, all of it balanced now on the edge of a knife. "Why did you leave them?" Alara asked. The boy was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire as if seeking answers in its dancing flames. "Because I remembered my mother's lullabies. Because when the pack surrounded a farmhouse last winter, I saw a little girl's face in the window and remembered what terror felt like from the other side." His hands trembled slightly. "Fenris said that made me weak, said I'd contaminated the pack's purity with human sentiment." "So you ran," Magnus said. "I ran. But running only works for so long." The boy met their eyes, and in that gaze was a terrible certainty. "He's coming for me, and he won't leave empty-handed. This place, your life here, it's all in danger because you chose to show me kindness." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. In the distance, carried on that mountain wind, came the sound that had haunted their nights, a howl that spoke of hunger and hunting and things that had forgotten how to be merciful. The boy lifted his head, listening with an intensity that made Alara's skin crawl. "They're closer tonight," he said simply. The boy's transformation had left an eerie silence hanging over the clearing like morning mist. Alara knelt beside Magnus, her weathered hands pressing against the gash on his shoulder where the great wolf's claws had found their mark. Blood seeped between her fingers, warm and urgent, but her husband's breathing remained steady. "We need to get him inside," she whispered, though she wasn't sure why she kept her voice low. The wolf was gone, vanished into the forest as suddenly as it had appeared. The mysterious boy stood at the edge of the clearing, his back turned to them, perfectly still. Magnus stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "The chickens," he mumbled, trying to sit up. "Hush now." Alara's grip tightened on his good shoulder. "The chickens are fine, most of them anyway." She glanced toward the scattered remains of their coop, splintered wood and torn wire mesh testament to the wolf's fury. 3 hens pecked nervously near the vegetable garden, but she couldn't account for the others. Small losses, she told herself. They were alive, and that was what mattered. The boy finally turned around, and Alara's breath caught. His eyes held an ancient quality that seemed impossible in someone so young, as if he'd witnessed centuries of wilderness secrets. Pine needles clung to his dark hair, and scratches covered his arms, but he moved with fluid grace as he approached them. "The wound needs cleaning," he said, his voice carrying that same otherworldly resonance she'd noticed before. "There's infection risk from wild claws." "Who are you?" Magnus asked, his voice stronger now despite the pain etched across his weathered features. "Where did you come from?" The boy crouched beside them, studying the gash with clinical detachment. "Names aren't important right now, but that wolf will return. It's protecting something and we've stumbled into its territory." "This is our land," Alara said firmly. "We've lived here for 40 years. No wolf has claim to it." A sad smile crossed the boy's features. "The forest doesn't recognize human boundaries. To the wolf, you're intruders who've built your nest too close to something precious." Magnus struggled to his feet with Alara's help, swaying slightly. What could be so important that it would risk attacking humans? Wolves usually avoid us. The boy's gaze drifted toward the dense tree line behind their cabin, where ancient pines stretched toward the clouded sky. There are places in these mountains where the old magic still runs strong, springs that heal, clearings where time moves differently, caves that connect to the heart of the earth itself. The wolf is a guardian. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You speak like you know this personally." "I know many things." The boy's attention returned to Magnus's wound, but knowledge comes with responsibility. You'll need to decide what you're willing to sacrifice to keep your home. Sacrifice. Magnus's voice sharpened despite his pain. We've already given everything to this mountain, raised our children here, buried our parents in that soil. This cabin holds our entire life. The boy nodded slowly, understanding flickering in those strange eyes. And the wolf has given everything to protect what lies beyond your fence line. Two families, both fighting for what they love most. Ilara helped Magnus toward the cabin steps, her mind racing. There has to be another way. Some kind of compromise. Perhaps. The boy followed them, his footsteps eerily silent on the fallen leaves. But first, we need to tend that wound properly, and then I'll show you what the wolf is truly guarding. Inside the cabin's warmth, Ilara gathered her medical supplies while the boy examined their bookshelves with curious interest. His fingers traced the spines of Magnus's forestry manuals and her collection of regional folklore. You've studied the old stories, he observed, pulling out a leather-bound volume about mountain legends. Research, Magnus explained, settling into his favorite chair near the fire. When you live this isolated, you learn to respect the tales locals tell. Usually there's truth buried in them. The boy opened the book, finding a particular passage with unsettling ease. Here, the guardian springs of Thornwood Peak. Waters that run deeper than memory, watched over by creatures of tooth and claw. Ilara paused in threading her needle. Those are just stories meant to keep hikers from wandering off marked trails. Are they? The boy's smile held secrets. Your property line ends at the old stone marker, correct? About 200 yards up the slope? Yes, but how did you... The spring lies just beyond that marker. It's been flowing for thousands of years, and the wolf's pack has guarded it for generations. Until recently, when development pressure started pushing deeper into the wilderness. Magnus winced as Ilara began cleaning his wound. Development? There's nothing up here but trees and rocks. The boy's expression darkened. There will be. The first surveying team arrives next week. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clearing as Elias knelt beside the stream, watching his reflection ripple in the current. 3 days had passed since the wolf's attack, and the strange sensations coursing through his body had only grown stronger. His hearing had sharpened to an almost painful degree. He could distinguish between the footsteps of different mice in the underbrush, hear Martha's heartbeat from inside the cabin 50 yards away. Boy! Henrik's gruff voice cut through his concentration. The old man approached slowly, favoring his bandaged leg. We need to talk. Elias stood, noting how Henrik's scent carried undertones of fear mixed with determination. The ability to read emotions through smell still unnerved him, another change he couldn't explain or control. About what happened, Henrik continued, settling heavily onto a fallen log. What you did to that wolf, that wasn't natural. The words hung between them like a physical barrier. Elias had been dreading this conversation, knowing it would come eventually. How could he explain what he didn't understand himself? I know, Elias said simply. Henrik's weathered hands worked at a piece of rope, his nervous habit when thinking deeply. Martha thinks you're some kind of blessing, a guardian sent to protect us. He looked up, his pale blue eyes searching Elias's face. But I've lived on this mountain for 40 years, boy. I know the difference between natural and other. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the surrounding peaks. Elias tracked its flight instinctively, his body tensing as if preparing to give chase. He forced himself to remain still. What do you think I am? Elias asked. I think you're dangerous, Henrik said bluntly. Maybe not by choice, but dangerous all the same. That power you showed, it's growing stronger, isn't it? Elias nodded reluctantly. Each day brought new changes. His teeth felt sharper, his nails harder. Sometimes at night, he caught himself growling softly in his sleep, a sound that wasn't entirely human. The stories my grandfather told, Henrik continued, spoke of children born between worlds, neither fully human nor fully beast, but something caught in the middle. They called them the Turned. The word struck Elias like a physical blow. Turned? Changed by forces beyond normal understanding. Some said they were cursed, others claimed they were blessed. But all the stories agreed on one thing: they never stayed in one place long. Their nature wouldn't let them. Martha's voice drifted from the cabin, humming an old lullaby as she worked. The sound made Elias's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. For the first time in his fractured memory, he'd found something resembling peace, a place where he might belong. "I won't hurt you," he said quietly. "Either of you." Henrik's expression softened slightly. "I believe you mean that. But meaning and doing aren't always the same thing, especially when instincts get involved." A rustle in the nearby bushes caught both their attention. Elias's head snapped toward the sound, his body coiling with predatory readiness. A rabbit emerged, pausing to nibble at the grass near the stream's edge. For a moment, Elias felt an overwhelming urge to hunt, to chase, to kill. His muscles bunched, preparing to spring. Henrik's hand landed firmly on his shoulder. Easy. The contact broke whatever spell had taken hold. Elias relaxed, but not before he caught the fear that flashed across Henrik's features. The old man had seen the change, the momentary transformation from boy to something else entirely. "It's getting harder to control," Elias admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we need to find you help. Real help." Henrik struggled to his feet, wincing as weight settled on his injured leg. "There's a woman. Lives deeper in the mountains. Some call her a witch, others say she's a healer. If anyone might understand what's happening to you, it'd be her." The idea of leaving the cabin, of venturing further into the unknown, filled Elias with dread. But Henrik was right. The changes were accelerating. Soon he might not be able to control them at all. "What about Martha?" Elias asked. "Will you tell her?" Henrik was quiet for a long moment, watching his wife through the cabin window as she prepared their morning meal. "She's already lost too much in her life. I won't take hope away from her unless I have to. And if this woman can't help me?" The old man's jaw tightened. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But right now, you're still mostly human, still our boy. We're not giving up on you yet." The rabbit bounded away into the underbrush, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. Elias watched it go, fighting down the predatory instincts that screamed at him to follow. Whatever he was becoming, whatever price his intervention had demanded, there might still be time to find answers. The question was whether those answers would save him or damn them all. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving crystalline air that carried every sound for miles. Elara stood at the cabin window, watching Kyle emerge from the forest with the same uncanny silence he'd maintained for 3 days. His clothes were torn, his dark hair matted with pine needles, and something that looked suspiciously like dried blood, but his eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before. Magnus looked up from sharpening his axe, the rhythmic scraping of whetstone against steel pausing. "Boy's been hunting." "Or being hunted," Elara murmured, noting the way Kyle moved, not with exhaustion, but with the fluid caution of prey that had survived an encounter with a predator. Kyle approached the cabin but stopped at the tree line, his head tilted as if listening to something beyond human hearing. When he finally stepped into the clearing, Elara saw what Magnus had missed from across the room. Dark stains covered the boy's hands, and his fingernails were cracked and blackened. "There's something you need to know," Kyle said without preamble, his voice rougher than before. "The wolf isn't just hunting livestock anymore." Magnus set down his axe. "What do you mean?" "I found remains. Human remains." Kyle's jaw tightened. The Hendersons' place about 5 miles north. The blood drained from Elara's face. She'd known Sarah Henderson since childhood. They'd traded preserves and gossip every autumn for 30 years. "Are you certain?" Kyle nodded grimly. "The wolf's territory has expanded. It's not just defending anymore, it's claiming." Magnus stood slowly, his weathered hands clenching. "How do you know all this? How do you know what that beast is thinking?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Kyle's expression shuttered, and for a moment Elara saw something wild flicker behind his dark eyes, something that made her step back instinctively. "I've been tracking it," Kyle said finally. learning its patterns. For 3 days? Magnus's voice carried doubt. In a storm that would have killed most men? Kyle's silence was answer enough. Ilara moved closer to her husband, suddenly aware of how small their cabin felt with Kyle inside it. The boy who had seemed so vulnerable when they'd first found him now radiated an energy that made the hair on her arms stand on end. "There's something else," Kyle continued. "The wolf isn't working alone. There are others, smaller ones but just as dangerous. They're moving in a pack formation I've never seen before." "How many others?" Magnus asked. 6, maybe 7. Kyle ran a hand through his tangled hair, and Ilara caught a glimpse of what looked like claw marks across his forearm. "They're organized, intelligent. Whatever's leading them has taught them to hunt as a unit." Magnus reached for his rifle, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. "Then we get word to the valley, warn the other families." "No." Kyle's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "That would only scatter the prey and make them harder to protect. The pack will pick off isolated families one by one." "Then what do you suggest?" Ilara demanded, her patience finally fraying. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come to us." Kyle looked directly at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, an ancient knowledge that had no place in someone so young. "We draw them here," he said, "all of them, and we end this." Magnus laughed harshly. "3 of us against a pack of wolves? You think we're soldiers?" "I think," Kyle said quietly, "that you don't understand what I'm offering." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters with an urgency that felt almost deliberate. "What are you?" Ilara whispered. Kyle met her gaze steadily. "Someone who can give you what you want. But first, I need to know, how far are you willing to go to protect your home?" Magnus stepped forward, placing himself between Kyle and his wife. "We've lived on this mountain for 40 years, raised children here, buried our parents in the soil behind the cabin. This is our land." "That's not what I asked." Kyle's voice carried an edge that seemed to resonate in the wooden walls around them. "I asked how far you're willing to go, because what I'm proposing will change everything. Once we start down this path, there's no going back to your quiet mountain life." Ilara felt Magnus tense beside her. Outside, a raven cawed 3 times, a sound that seemed less like birdsong and more like a warning. "The pack will be here by tomorrow night," Kyle continued. "They can smell me now, smell what I've been doing in the forest. They know I'm a threat to their territory." "What have you been doing?" Magnus demanded. Kyle smiled, and for the first time since they'd known him, it didn't look entirely human. "Preparing for war." The morning mist clung to the mountainside like a shroud as Ilara made her way down the familiar path to the village. Her basket, heavy with jars of honey and dried herbs, swayed with each careful step. The events of the past weeks felt like fragments of a fever dream. The massive wolf, the mysterious boy who could speak its language, the way he'd vanished into the forest as suddenly as he'd appeared. She'd convinced herself that life could return to normal, that the nightmares would fade and the scratch marks on their cabin door would weather away with time. But as she rounded the bend that opened onto the village square, the hushed conversations and worried glances told a different story. "Ilara!" Martha's voice carried across the market stalls, sharp with urgency. The baker's wife hurried over, her flour-dusted apron flapping. "Thank the spirits you're here. Have you seen it? The signs?" "What signs?" Ilara set down her basket, noting how the other villagers had begun to gather, their faces etched with familiar fear. Old Henrik stepped forward, his weathered hands gripping a carved walking stick. "Livestock torn apart, 3 farms hit in 2 nights. But that's not the strangest part." He lowered his voice to a whisper. "The tracks they found, they're not just wolf prints." Ilara's blood chilled. "What do you mean?" "Some are human," Martha said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Bare feet, walking alongside the beast. The mountain folk are saying it's cursed, that the wolf has taken someone." The basket slipped from Ilara's numb fingers, honey jars clinking against each other. In her mind's eye, she saw the boy's amber eyes, the way his voice had carried an otherworldly resonance when he'd spoken to the great wolf, the way he'd touched the creature's massive head with such familiarity. Where were the attacks? She managed to ask. Henrik pointed toward the eastern slopes, starting at the Morrison farm, then the Hendricks place, moving west toward, he paused, studying her pale face, toward your mountain. The gathered villagers began murmuring among themselves, their voices rising with each shared fear. Someone mentioned organizing another hunting party. Another suggested burning offerings at the old shrine. But Ilara heard none of it clearly, her thoughts consumed by a terrible understanding. The boy hadn't saved them, he'd claimed them. She gathered her scattered goods with trembling hands, mumbling excuses about Thomas needing her help with repairs. The journey home felt endless, each shadow between the trees a potential threat, each rustle of leaves a whispered warning. Thomas was splitting wood when she crested the final ridge, his steady rhythm a comforting constant in a world that seemed increasingly unstable. But even he paused when he saw her face. What happened in the village? He set down his axe, wiping sweat from his brow. Ilara told him everything, watching his expression grow graver with each detail. When she finished, they stood in silence, the mountain wind carrying the scent of pine and something else, something wild and predatory. "The boy," Thomas said finally. "He's not what we thought." "No." Ilara's voice was barely audible. "I think he's exactly what we should have expected." As if summoned by their words, a howl echoed across the mountainside, long, mournful, and unmistakably close. It was answered by another sound, higher, more human, but carrying the same wild hunger. Thomas reached for the rifle he'd taken to keeping by the cabin door. "Get inside!" But before Ilara could move, the boy emerged from the tree line. He looked different now, his clothes more tattered, his hair wilder. There was earth under his fingernails and something dark stained around his mouth. His amber eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made her step backward. "You've been talking to the villagers," he said, and his voice carried new harmonics, like an echo of the wolf's growl beneath human words. "They're afraid," Thomas replied, his hand steady on the rifle, though he hadn't yet raised it. "People are dying." The boy tilted his head, the gesture eerily canine. "The pack needs to eat. The territory needs to be secured." "Pack?" Ilara's voice cracked. "You welcomed me," the boy said, and for a moment his expression seemed almost sad. "Fed me, gave me shelter when I was lost between worlds. That makes you family now, under pack protection." "We never asked for protection," Thomas said. "You did when you accepted me." The boy's smile revealed teeth that seemed sharper than before. "The wolf you feared is gone. What hunts now is something new, something that understands both human strategy and beast strength." Behind him, massive shapes began to emerge from the forest. Wolves, but also something else, figures that moved with human intelligence but animal grace. The boys converted, Ilara realized with growing horror. Villagers who'd chosen transformation over death. "You have a choice," the boy continued. "Join willingly, or be protected against your will. Either way, this mountain is pack territory now." The rifle trembled in Thomas's grip as he finally understood the true price of the mysterious boy's intervention. The wolf's howl shattered the pre-dawn silence, reverberating through the valley like a death knell. Elena bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as the mournful sound seemed to seep through the cabin walls themselves. Beside her, Thomas was already reaching for his rifle, his weathered hands steady despite the tremor she'd noticed growing stronger each day. "It's closer," she whispered, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The temperature had dropped during the night, and frost painted delicate patterns across the windows. Thomas nodded grimly, checking the rifle's chamber. Too close. Through the thin walls, they could hear Kyle stirring in the small alcove they'd prepared for him. The boy had been with them for 3 days now, and Elena still felt unsettled by his presence. There was something about the way he moved, fluid and predatory, that reminded her uncomfortably of the very creature they feared. The door creaked open, and Kyle emerged, already fully dressed despite having been asleep moments before. His dark eyes held an alertness that seemed impossible for someone who had just awakened. "It's hunting," he said simply, his voice carrying an odd resonance in the morning stillness. "The scent of blood is strong tonight." "Whose blood?" Thomas demanded, rising to his feet with a grunt. His joints protested the sudden movement, but he ignored the pain. Kyle's nostrils flared slightly, and Elena felt her stomach clench. The gesture was too animalistic, too knowing. "Dear, but it won't be satisfied with that for long." The boy moved to the window, pressing his face against the glass. In the pale moonlight filtering through the clouds, Elena could see his breath fogging the surface. When he pulled back, she noticed his canine teeth seemed more prominent than before, catching the silver light. "We need to leave," Kyle said, turning to face them. "Tonight. This is our home," Elena protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "We can't just abandon everything." "Your home won't matter if you're dead." The bluntness of his words hit like a physical blow. Kyle's expression softened slightly when he saw her flinch. "I'm sorry, but it's true. The wolf isn't just hunting for food anymore. It's marking territory, claiming this entire mountainside as its own." Thomas moved to stand beside his wife, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "And you know this how, boy?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Elena had noticed things over the past few days, the way Kyle never seemed surprised by the wolf's appearances, how he always knew exactly where it had been, the strange marks she'd glimpsed along his forearms that looked suspiciously like claw marks. Kyle was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I can feel it, in here." He pressed a hand to his chest, over his heart, its hunger, its rage, its need to dominate. It's like a fire burning through everything else. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I understand the wolf, because we're more alike than I wanted to admit." Kyle's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I've been fighting it for so long, trying to stay human, but the longer I'm near the creature, the harder it becomes." Another howl pierced the night, closer now, and Elena could swear she heard an answering tremor in Kyle's breathing. The boy's eyes reflected the moonlight for just an instant, glowing with an inner fire before he turned away. "There's something else," he continued, his voice strained. "The wolf isn't working alone. There are others coming." "Others?" Thomas's grip tightened on his rifle. "More wolves? Worse." Kyle faced them again, and Elena could see the fear naked in his young features, things that should have stayed buried in the deep woods. The wolf's presence has awakened them, called them to this place. They'll arrive within days. Elena sank back onto the bed, overwhelmed. Everything they had built here, their entire life together, was crumbling around them like autumn leaves. Where would we even go? "There's a place," Kyle said, "hidden in the high peaks, protected by old magic that even the wolf respects. But the journey is dangerous, especially for—" He paused, glancing at Thomas's rifle, at Elena's frail frame. "For old fools like us," Thomas finished with bitter humor. Kyle's expression grew fierce. "For people I care about." The simple admission hit Elena like a thunderbolt. Despite everything strange and frightening about the boy, she realized she had begun to care for him too. Perhaps that was why his otherworldly nature disturbed her so deeply. She was already too attached to lose him to whatever darkness he carried within. Outside, branches snapped under heavy footfalls, and a low growl rumbled through the forest. "Decide quickly," Kyle whispered, his form already shifting toward the door. "It's here." The morning mist clung to the mountainside like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release its hold on the familiar peaks Martha had known for 43 years. She stood at the kitchen window watching Thomas tend to the wounded goats with gentle hands that trembled more than they used to. The boy, Kai, sat cross-legged nearby, perfectly still except for his eyes that tracked every movement in the forest beyond. 3 days had passed since the great wolf's attack, yet the memory lingered like smoke in her lungs. The creature's yellow eyes haunted her dreams, but it was Kai's transformation that truly unsettled her waking hours. She had witnessed something impossible, something that defied every natural law she'd accepted as absolute truth. "You're afraid of me now." Martha spun from the window. Kai stood in the doorway, his bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors. His human appearance seemed fragile somehow, as if she might glimpse fur beneath his skin if she looked too closely. "Not afraid," she said carefully, then reconsidered. "Perhaps uncertain." He nodded, those ancient eyes understanding far more than any child should. "The pack will return, tonight, maybe tomorrow. They know I'm here now." "The pack?" Martha's hand found the back of her chair for support. "There are more?" "7 others. The one you saw was their leader, but they hunt together." Kai moved to the window, his nostrils flaring slightly. "They've been following my scent for weeks, maybe months. I thought I could hide here, that this place was too small for them to notice." "Hide from what? Who are you really?" For a long moment, Kai remained silent. Outside, a crow cawed harshly, as if echoing Martha's question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to age him before her eyes. "My people called them the Devourers, wolves that fed on more than flesh. They consumed the essence of wild places, leaving nothing but emptiness behind." His small hands pressed against the window glass. "My village tried to stop them. We had gifts, ways of speaking to the forest, of becoming part of it when necessary." Martha felt her throat tighten. "Had? They came in winter when the snow was deep and escape was impossible. I was the only one who got away, but only because my grandmother sent me into the deep change as the village burned." His reflection in the glass looked older than his years. "I've been running ever since, but you can't run forever from something that feeds on the wild itself." The kitchen door creaked open, and Thomas stepped inside, his boots heavy with mud and concern. He looked between Martha and Kai, reading the tension like weather signs. "What's wrong?" "They're coming back," Martha said quietly. "More of them." Thomas's face hardened. He moved to the gun cabinet, checking the old rifle with practiced hands. "How many?" "8 total," Kai answered. "But bullets won't stop them. They're not entirely of this world anymore." "Then what do we do?" Thomas's voice carried the stubborn determination that had seen them through decades of mountain hardships. Kai turned from the window, and Martha saw something shift in his expression, a resolve that seemed too heavy for such young shoulders. "I lead them away, far from here, where they can't hurt anyone else." "Absolutely not." The words left Martha's mouth before she could stop them. "You're just a child." "I stopped being a child the night my village died." Kai's voice held no self-pity, only fact. "And I'm the only one left who can become what they are, while still remembering what it means to be human." Thomas set down the rifle. "There has to be another way." "There is." Kai's eyes met Martha's, and she saw both apology and determination there. "But it means this place changes forever. The boundary between the human world and the wild one would become thinner here, permanent." Martha understood without needing details. Their quiet mountain life, their careful routine of seasons and solitude would become something else entirely, something touched by forces that most people believed were only stories. "What exactly are you proposing?" Thomas asked. "I make a stand here instead of running. Use this place as an anchor to pull them fully into our world, where they can be fought. But the process would mark this land, make it a crossing point between worlds." Kai looked at both of them seriously. "You'd become guardians of something much larger than your farm." Martha felt Thomas take her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. In 43 years of marriage, they had faced drought, harsh winters, illness and isolation. They had built something precious in these mountains, something worth protecting. "And if we refuse?" she asked. "Then I go, and they follow eventually anyway. But by then, they'll be stronger, hungrier." Kai's honesty was brutal in its simplicity. This is the best chance to stop them. Outside, the mist finally began to lift. revealing the peaks they called home in sharp, clear detail. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows differently now, as if the world itself had shifted overnight. Ilara sat at the kitchen table, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. Across from her, Magnus stared out at the tree line where Kyle had vanished 3 days ago. "He'll come back," she whispered, though her voice carried little conviction. Magnus turned from the window, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Will he? Or will whatever's happening to him keep him away? He gestured toward the scratches gouged deep into their front door, marks that hadn't been there before Kyle's last transformation. "Those aren't from any ordinary wolf, Ilara. They're too precise, too deliberate." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken fears. Since the boy had first appeared in their lives, everything had changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. The massive wolf that had terrorized the mountain for months was gone, yes, but something else had taken its place. Something that wore Kyle's face by day and became increasingly unknowable by night. A distant howl echoed across the valley, long and mournful. Ilara's cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down with trembling fingers. "That's not him," she said quickly. "That can't be him." But Magnus had spent too many years in these mountains, had learned to read the language of the wild too well. The howl carried a familiar cadence, a tone that spoke of intelligence rather than mere animal instinct. "I'm going after him," he announced, pushing back from the table. "Magnus, no." Ilara caught his arm as he passed. "What if you find him and what if he doesn't recognize you?" The question hung between them like a blade. They had both seen the way Kyle's eyes sometimes went distant during their evening conversations, how his head would tilt at sounds they couldn't hear, how his fingers would unconsciously curl like claws when he thought no one was watching. Before Magnus could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts echoed from the direction of the village below, and the sharp crack of gunfire split the morning air. They rushed to the window together, peering down the mountainside where they could see figures moving through the trees, hunters by the look of their gear. "They're tracking something," Magnus said grimly. "Something big, by the way they're moving." Another howl answered the gunshots, closer this time, and Ilara felt her heart clench. The sound carried pain now, and rage, and something else that chilled her to the bone. Recognition. Whatever was down there knew exactly what was hunting it. "We have to warn them," she said, already reaching for her coat. "They don't know what they're dealing with." Magnus grabbed his rifle from above the mantelpiece, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. "They won't listen to warnings about a boy who turns into something that shouldn't exist. They'll think we've lost our minds." But even as he spoke, they were both moving toward the door. The hunters' voices grew louder, more urgent, and another shot rang out, followed immediately by a sound that made them both freeze, the unmistakable crash of something massive moving through the underbrush at impossible speed. They emerged from the cabin just as one of the hunters broke through the tree line 50 yards below them, stumbling and falling as he looked back over his shoulder. His face was white with terror and blood soaked through his jacket sleeve. "Run!" he screamed up at them. "Get inside and lock your doors. There's something down there that ain't natural." Before either Magnus or Ilara could respond, the forest behind the fleeing man erupted. Trees bent and snapped as a dark shape burst into view, moving with fluid grace despite its massive size. For a moment, Ilara hoped desperately that it was the original wolf, the beast they had first encountered months ago. But then she saw the eyes, brilliant green, unmistakably human, even in that transformed face, and her hope crumbled. Kyle had grown larger since his last transformation, his dark fur rippling with muscle that spoke of something beyond mere wolf anatomy. He moved with purpose, herding the remaining hunters away from the mountain's upper reaches, away from the cabin, but his methods were becoming increasingly violent. One hunter who turned to fire at him was sent flying into a tree with a casual swipe of claws. "He's protecting us," Ilara breathed, understanding flooding through her even as horror gripped her heart. "He's driving them away from us, but he's losing himself in the process." Magnus raised his rifle, then lowered it again, his hands shaking. How do you save someone who's becoming the very thing that salvation requires them to be? How do you call back a boy who's drowning in an ancient power that grows stronger with each transformation? Below them, Kyle's howl rose again, but this time it sounded less like communication and more like a lament, the cry of something caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows differently now, as if the very quality of sunlight had changed overnight. Marta stood at the kitchen window, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, watching Kyle move through the garden with an otherworldly grace. His transformation the night before had left them all shaken, but what disturbed her most was how natural he looked now, as if he had finally shed a skin that never quite fit. Henrik emerged from the bedroom, his limp more pronounced after yesterday's ordeal. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and Marta could see the weight of unspoken questions in his expression. They had agreed to give the boy time, but time was a luxury they might not have. The tracks, Henrik said quietly, settling beside her at the window. They lead deeper into the mountain. Marta nodded. She had seen them too. Massive paw prints that seemed to burn themselves into the earth, creating a trail that spoke of ancient power and terrible purpose. The great wolf had retreated, but she knew with cold certainty that it would return. Kyle paused in his work, his head tilting as if he heard something beyond their perception. When he turned toward the cabin, his eyes held flecks of gold that hadn't been there before. The change was subtle but undeniable, like watching a painting slowly alter its colors when no one was looking. "We need to talk to him," Henrik murmured. Before Marta could respond, a low rumble echoed from the mountains, so deep it seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The windows rattled in their frames, and somewhere in the distance, birds erupted from the tree line in a frantic cloud of wings and cries. Kyle was at their door before the sound faded, moving with a speed that made Marta's breath catch. His face was grave, older somehow than his apparent years. "It's calling them," he said without preamble. "The others of its kind. They're coming." Henrik straightened despite his injuries. "How many?" "3, maybe 4, ancient ones like the first." Kyle's voice carried a strange resonance, as if spoken from the depths of a cavern. "They've slept for decades, but his call has awakened them." Marta set down her coffee with deliberate care. "Why? What do they want?" Kyle's gaze shifted between them, and she saw something that might have been shame flicker across his features. "Me. They want me to choose." "Choose what?" "Whether to join them or stand against them." He ran a hand through his dark hair, and Marta noticed his fingers ended in nails that were longer, sharper than they had been. "The power I carry, it comes from the same source as theirs. We are connected by blood and magic that runs deeper than human understanding." Henrik moved to the window, scanning the tree line with the careful attention of a man who had spent his life reading the mountain's moods. "And if you choose to stand against them, then they will destroy everything in these mountains to prove their dominance. Every cabin, every settlement, every living thing that carries human scent." Kyle's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "It is their way. And if you join them?" The silence stretched long enough that Marta felt her heart hammering against her ribs. When Kyle finally spoke, his words were barely a whisper. "Then I become what they are, fully, forever, and humanity becomes prey." The implications settled over them like a shroud. Marta understood now why the boy had seemed so lost when they first found him, why he carried such weight in his young shoulders. He was not just caught between worlds, he was the bridge that could either save or damn them all. "There has to be another way," she said firmly. Kyle's smile was sad and ancient. "I thought so too. I've been running from this choice for longer than you can imagine, hoping to find some third path. But the old magic doesn't allow for compromise. It demands absolutes." Another rumble shook the mountain, closer this time. Through the window, they could see movement in the distant forest, shadows too large and too fluid to be anything natural. "How long do we have?" Henrik asked. They'll reach the valley by sunset. The leader wants to face me when the moon rises full." Kyle looked at them both with eyes that held depths of sorrow and steel. "I won't let you come to harm because of what I am. I'll meet them before they reach the cabin." "Like hell you will," Marta said sharply. "This is our home, and you're under our protection." The boy stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "You don't understand the forces at play here." "I understand that a scared young man is trying to face impossible odds alone." Marta moved to stand before him, reaching up to place her hands on his shoulders. "And I understand that sometimes the bravest thing isn't to sacrifice yourself, it's to let others help carry the burden." For a moment, the inhuman mask slipped from Kyle's features, revealing the frightened youth beneath. In that instant, Marta saw not a creature of legend, but simply a boy who had never learned that he didn't have to face the darkness alone. The storm that had been brewing all morning finally broke as Kyle limped through the forest, his legs still aching from the previous night's transformation. Lightning split the sky above the canopy, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very earth beneath his feet. Each flash illuminated the path ahead in stark, ghostly detail before plunging everything back into premature twilight. He knew he was being followed long before he saw them. The pack moved like shadows between the trees, their eyes gleaming amber in the darkness. These weren't ordinary wolves. They carried themselves with an intelligence that made his skin crawl, and their scent bore the unmistakable mark of the great black wolf's influence. Somehow, his enemy had found a way to corrupt others, to spread his darkness like a disease. Kyle forced himself to maintain a steady pace, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. Running would only trigger their hunting instincts, and in his current weakened state, he couldn't afford a chase. The old couple's cabin was still miles away, and he needed to reach them before these creatures did. Martha and Henrik had shown him kindness when the world had given him only fear and rejection. He wouldn't let them pay the price for his failures. A low growl echoed from his left, closer than before. Kyle's hand instinctively moved to the crude knife at his belt, a pitiful weapon against what stalked him, but it was all he had. The transformation had left him drained, as it always did, stripping away the very power he needed most when danger threatened. Through the rain he caught sight of a familiar landmark, the lightning-struck pine that marked the halfway point to the cabin. Its blackened trunk stood like a monument to nature's fury, and Kyle felt a grim kinship with its scarred bark. He pressed forward, his boots squelching in the muddy earth, while the pack maintained their distance, herding him like prey toward some unseen trap. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't hunting him, they were driving him toward the cabin. The great wolf had learned from their previous encounters, adapting his tactics. Instead of confronting Kyle directly, he was using the boy's own protective instincts against him, forcing him to choose between his own safety and the lives of the only people who had ever treated him with genuine care. Kyle stopped walking. Rain streamed down his face as he turned slowly, scanning the shadows between the trees. Yellow eyes watched him from a dozen different positions, patient and predatory. Behind him lay the path to safety, to Martha's warm kitchen and Henrik's steady presence. Ahead lay uncertainty and almost certain death, but if he continued toward the cabin, he would be leading this corruption directly to their door. "I know what you want," he called out to the darkness, his voice barely carrying over the storm, "but you won't get it through them." A massive shape detached itself from behind a cluster of birch trees. The corrupted alpha was nearly as large as the great black wolf himself, its fur matted with something that wasn't quite blood, but gleamed wetly in the lightning flashes. When it opened its mouth, Kyle saw rows of teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp, as if the creature's very nature had been twisted into something more monstrous than any natural wolf. The old ones have served their purpose. The alpha spoke, its voice a guttural approximation of human speech that made Kyle's stomach turn. "They brought you to us. Now they are unnecessary." Rage flooded through Kyle's exhausted body, bringing with it the familiar burning sensation that preceded his transformation. But he fought it back, knowing he was too weak for another change so soon. Instead, he drew his knife and shifted into a fighting stance Henrik had taught him during their sparring sessions. "You want me?" Kyle snarled, feeling his canine teeth extend slightly as his control wavered. "Then come and take me, but leave them out of this." The Alpha's laugh was like breaking glass. "You misunderstand, little wolf. This was never about taking you. This is about making you watch as everything you care for turns to ash." The pack began to move, not toward Kyle, but around him, flowing like dark water through the trees toward the cabin. Panic seized him as he realized the true scope of the trap. They had never intended to fight him here. They had wanted him exactly where he was, too far away to help, close enough to witness the destruction. Kyle abandoned all pretense of caution and ran. Branches whipped at his face as he crashed through the underbrush, his injured leg screaming in protest. Behind him, he could hear the Alpha's mocking laughter fading as the pack raced ahead on paths they knew better than he did. The cabin's lights appeared through the trees just as the first howls began. Kyle burst from the forest to see shadows circling the small building and Martha's terrified face pressed against the kitchen window. Henrik stood on the porch with his hunting rifle, but Kyle could see the old man's hands shaking as he faced odds that no ordinary weapon could overcome. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountain clearing as Kyle knelt beside the still form of the great wolf. His hands trembled as they hovered over the massive flank, no longer rising and falling with breath. The silver-streaked fur that had once rippled with otherworldly power now lay motionless, catching the light like tarnished metal. "It's done," he whispered, though the words felt hollow in his throat. Martha approached slowly, her weathered hands clutching a rough woolen blanket. Behind her, Thomas limped forward, his legs still bearing the marks of their earlier encounter with the beast. Neither spoke as they witnessed the boy's grief, understanding instinctively that something profound had shifted in the natural order of their mountain. The wolf's eyes, once burning with ancient fury, had dimmed to the color of winter sky. In death, the creature seemed smaller somehow, as if the rage that had sustained it had been the very thing that made it monstrous. Now it appeared almost peaceful, like a guardian finally released from an unbearable duty. Kyle's fingers found the soft spot behind the wolf's ears, stroking gently. "I never knew her name," he said, his voice breaking. "In all the dreams, all the visions, she never told me her name." Thomas cleared his throat roughly. "Some names are too powerful to speak aloud, boy. Maybe that was hers." The old man's words carried weight, but they couldn't fill the emptiness spreading through Kyle's chest. He had felt the moment when the wolf's spirit departed, had experienced the sudden silence where her consciousness had pressed against his for so long. The constant whisper of wildness that had colored his thoughts since childhood was gone, leaving behind a quiet that felt deafening. Martha knelt beside them, her joints creaking in protest. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing the wolf's muzzle. "She was beautiful," she murmured. "Terrible, but beautiful." "She was lonely," Kyle replied, finally understanding. "Alone for so long that the loneliness turned to madness. I think she was the last of something, the last guardian, the last keeper of old laws that no one remembered." The wind picked up, rustling through the pine trees that surrounded their clearing. With it came the sense of normal forest life. Squirrels and rabbits, birds and insects, the small creatures that had hidden during the wolf's reign of terror. Already, the mountain was beginning to breathe again. But Kyle felt the change in himself too. Where once his senses had been supernaturally sharp, now they dulled to merely human levels. The easy strength that had allowed him to match the wolf's power was fading, leaving behind the ordinary muscles of a teenage boy. He was becoming fully human, and the realization filled him with unexpected loss. Thomas seemed to sense his struggle. "Power isn't always about what you can do, son. Sometimes it's about knowing when to let go." Kyle nodded, though he wasn't sure he truly understood yet. He looked up at the couple who had taken him in, who had shown him kindness when he was little more than a wild thing himself. Their faces bore new lines of worry and exhaustion, but also something else, a quiet acceptance that spoke of lives lived close to nature's harsh truths. "What happens now?" he asked. Martha smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features. "Now we bury her properly. Then we go home, and I make you the biggest breakfast you've ever seen. Growing boys need their strength." The simple domesticity of her words should have felt jarring after everything they'd witnessed, but instead they offered comfort. Home. The word carried new meaning now, tied not to the wild places where he'd wandered for so long, but to a warm kitchen and two people who cared whether he was fed and safe. They worked together to prepare the wolf for burial, wrapping her great form in Martha's blanket. Thomas disappeared briefly and returned with a shovel, though it would take considerable effort to dig a grave large enough. Kyle surprised them both by asking if they might bury her on the ridge overlooking the valley, where she could watch over the territory she had protected and terrorized in equal measure. As they began the difficult task of moving the wolf's body, Kyle felt something shift in the air around them, not the charged tension that had preceded supernatural encounters, but something gentler. The mountain itself seemed to exhale, as if releasing a breath held too long. For the first time since arriving in this place, Kyle could imagine a future that stretched beyond the next crisis, the next battle. It was a strange feeling, this hope, fragile as new leaves but growing stronger with each passing moment. The price of peace had been higher than any of them had anticipated, but perhaps, in the end, it would prove worthwhile. The wolf's story was ending, but theirs was just beginning. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like whispered secrets as Ilara made her way down the familiar path to the village below. Her basket swayed with each careful step, filled with the herbs and remedies that had sustained her reputation as a healer for decades. But today, something felt different. The very air seemed charged with an electricity she couldn't name. 3 weeks had passed since the great wolf's defeat, and Kyle had grown stronger each day. The mysterious boy who had saved their lives now moved through their cabin with an easy familiarity, chopping wood with inhuman precision and tracking game with senses that defied explanation. Yet beneath his helpful exterior, Ilara sensed a restlessness growing like storm clouds on the horizon. The village of Millhaven spread before her as she crested the final ridge, its thatched roofs and stone chimneys a comforting sight after the isolation of recent months. But as she drew closer, she noticed clusters of people gathered in hushed conversation, their faces etched with worry. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent as she passed, and Martha Henley crossed herself when their eyes met. "Ilara!" called out Thomas Brennan, the village elder, his weathered hand raised in greeting though his expression remained grave. "We need to speak with you." She set down her basket in the village square, noting how the usual bustle of market day had been replaced by an uneasy quiet. Children who normally ran laughing through the streets now clung to their mothers' skirts, casting fearful glances toward the mountains. "It's about the boy," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one staying with you and Henrik." Ilara's heart quickened. "What about him?" "Strange things have been happening," said Martha, stepping forward with her infant clutched tightly to her chest. "Livestock going missing but not eaten, just taken. And the tracks," she shuddered. "They're not natural, Ilara. They start as human prints, then change into something else entirely." "My sheep won't graze in the northern pastures anymore," added Willem the shepherd. They huddle together, trembling like they can smell death on the wind. "And twice now, I've seen a shadow moving through the trees, too big to be a man, too deliberate to be a wolf." Thomas leaned closer, his rheumy eyes fixed on hers. "The boy you've taken in, where did he truly come from? Because the stories we're hearing, the signs we're seeing—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They speak of something that shouldn't exist in our world." Ilara felt the weight of their stares, the fear that radiated from every face in the circle that had formed around her. These were good people, hard-working folk who had trusted her judgment for years. How could she explain what she herself barely understood? How could she tell them that the boy who had saved them all carried within him the very wildness they feared? "Kyle is no threat to you," she said finally, though her voice lacked the conviction she'd hoped for. "He protected us from the great wolf. Without him, Henrik and I would be dead." "But at what cost?" demanded Marcus Webb, the miller's son. "My father saw him 3 nights ago, running through the forest. Said he moved like liquid shadow, faster than any creature had a right to. And when he howled—" Marcus swallowed hard. "It wasn't human, Ilara. Whatever he's becoming, it isn't human." The word "becoming" hit her like a physical blow. She thought of the changes she'd noticed in Kyle, the way his eyes sometimes seemed to glow in dim light, how he could track scents days old, the inhuman grace with which he moved through the wilderness. Had saving them from one monster simply introduced another? "There's something else," Thomas said quietly. "Travelers from the eastern settlements bring word of similar creatures, boys and young men who can take wolf form at will, but who lose more of their humanity with each transformation. They say these beings eventually forget their human nature entirely. They're called skinwalkers in the old tongue," whispered an elderly woman from the back of the crowd. "Neither man nor beast, but something caught between. The stories say they're drawn to violence, that they feed on fear and chaos." Ilara's hands trembled as she picked up her basket. "Kyle saved our lives," she repeated, but the words felt hollow now. "He chose to protect us rather than destroy us." "This time," Thomas said gently. "But what happens when his wild nature grows stronger? What happens when the beast inside him decides that civilization itself is the enemy?" The questions followed her as she climbed back up the mountain path, each step heavier than the last. Behind her, the village resumed its fearful whispers, and ahead of her waited a boy who might already be more wolf than human. The mist seemed thicker now, obscuring the familiar landmarks, as if the mountain itself was hiding secrets too dangerous for daylight. By the time she reached the cabin, Ilara had made her decision, though it broke her heart to consider it. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like a shroud, but beneath its veil something fundamental had shifted. Magnus could feel it in his bones as he stood at the cabin's threshold, watching Kyle move through the clearing with an otherworldly grace. The boy, though calling him a boy now felt inadequate, gathered fallen branches with movements that seemed to flow between human and wolf, each gesture precise yet wild. "He's changing faster now," Ilara whispered beside him, her weathered hand finding his arm. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of sleepless nights spent watching over their strange ward. "Did you see him last night? The way his eyes reflected the firelight?" Magnus had seen. More than that, he'd felt the pull of something ancient and untamed, radiating from Kyle like heat from a forge. The transformation that had begun weeks ago was accelerating, and with it came a growing unease that settled in Magnus's chest like a stone. Kyle paused in his work, head tilting as if catching a scent on the wind. His nostrils flared, and for a moment his features seemed to elongate, becoming more lupine. Then he straightened, the illusion, if it had been one, vanishing as he turned toward the cabin with a smile that no longer quite reached his eyes. "The pack is moving closer," he said, his voice carrying an odd resonance that made the hair on Magnus's arms stand on end. "I can hear them calling. They know what I've become." Ilara stepped forward, maternal instinct overriding caution. "What you've become, Kyle, you're still you. You're still human?" The word came out as something between a laugh and a growl. "I was never entirely human, Ilara. The great wolf's blood runs in my veins now. His power, his hunger, his need to protect what matters." His gaze swept over the clearing, encompassing the cabin, the garden, the life they'd built together. "This place. You. It's all I have left of who I was." Magnus felt the weight of unspoken truth settling around them like the morning mist. "And the pack? What do they want?" "They want their new alpha." Kyle's eyes flashed amber in the pale light. "The great wolf is gone, but his power needs a vessel. They've been waiting, testing me, seeing if I'm worthy." He flexed his hands, and Magnus could swear he saw claws extend briefly from his fingertips. Last night, I passed their final trial. The memory hit Magnus like a physical blow, the howling that had echoed through the darkness, primal and triumphant. He'd assumed it was the distant pack, but now he realized the truth. That sound of victory and loss and terrible becoming had come from much closer. It had come from Kyle. "You can't go to them," Ilara said, stepping closer with the fierce protectiveness that had made her such a formidable mountain woman. "This is your home. We're your family." Kyle's expression softened for a moment, revealing a glimpse of the lost boy they'd taken in. "You saved me when I was broken. You gave me purpose, love, a reason to become more than just a vessel for vengeance." He reached out, touching Ilara's cheek with surprising gentleness. "But the pack needs guidance. Without a true alpha, they'll turn on each other, or worse, on the settlements below. The balance the great wolf maintained will crumble." "Then let it," Magnus said roughly. "You don't owe them anything. You don't owe anyone." "I owe everything." Kyle's voice carried the weight of mountains, of ancient promises and blood debts. The great wolf's final gift wasn't just power, it was responsibility, the knowledge of what happens when the wild places are left unguarded. His eyes found Magnus's, and in them swirled depths of wisdom and sorrow that belonged to no boy. "I've seen what comes after the wolves, Magnus, what hunts in the spaces between stars. The great wolf kept those things at bay for centuries." A chill wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of distant snow and something else, something that made every instinct scream danger. Kyle's head snapped up, nostrils flaring as he scented the air. "They're here," he said simply. At the tree line, shapes began to materialize from the mist, wolves, but larger than any Magnus had ever seen, their eyes gleaming with an intelligence that was both alien and familiar. At their head stood a massive silver female, her gaze fixed unwaveringly on Kyle. "The choice has to be made," Kyle murmured, and Magnus heard the boy he'd been warring with the alpha he was becoming. "Today. Now. Either I take my place with them, or I watch everything I've learned to love burn in the chaos that follows." The pack's howl rose like a prayer and a challenge combined, echoing off the mountain walls and settling deep in their bones. Magnus reached for Ilara's hand, knowing that whatever came next would change everything, that the quiet mountain life they'd cherished was ending with the morning mist. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like a shroud, and Ilara knew something had changed in the boy overnight. Kyle sat motionless on the cabin's front step, his small frame rigid against the wooden planks, staring into the forest with eyes that seemed to hold depths she'd never noticed before. The wolf, their wolf, as she'd come to think of him, lay nearby, but even the great beast appeared restless, occasionally lifting his massive head to study the child with what looked disturbingly like concern. "Kyle?" she called softly, stepping onto the porch with a steaming cup of pine needle tea. When he didn't respond, she settled beside him, noting how his skin had taken on an almost translucent quality in the pale morning light. "What is it, child?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then, without looking at her, he whispered, "They're coming today." The words sent ice through her veins. "Who's coming?" "The hunters, the ones who've been tracking him." He nodded toward the wolf, whose ears had flattened against his skull. "They've found our trail, all of our trails." Henrik emerged from the cabin, his weathered face creased with worry. He'd heard enough to understand the gravity of the situation. "How many?" "7. Kyle's voice carried an odd resonance, as if it came from somewhere deeper than his small chest. "They've been following the signs of the attacks on the other settlements. They know something unnatural is happening in these mountains." Ilara reached out to touch the boy's shoulder and gasped. His skin was fever-hot, yet she could feel tremors running through him like small earthquakes. "Kyle, what's happening to you?" For the first time that morning he turned to look at her, and she had to suppress a cry. His eyes, once the warm brown of forest earth, now flickered with golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The binding is weakening, the one that keeps me in this form. Using my power to heal him, to change him. It's unraveling what I am, what you are." Henrik stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Kyle, what are you?" The boy stood slowly, his movements carrying a fluid grace that seemed impossible for human joints. As he rose, the wolf lifted his head, and for a moment the resemblance between them was unmistakable. The same golden eyes, the same predatory alertness, the same ancient intelligence. "I was the first," Kyle said, his small hand resting on the wolf's massive head, "the first to change, to bridge the gap between human and beast. But I chose to become smaller, weaker, to hide among your kind. The magic that bound me to this shape is breaking down." Elara felt her world tilting. "You're like him. You're both?" "We're both caught between worlds," Kyle confirmed. "But where he was lost to rage and hunger, I remember what it means to choose compassion. That memory is what allowed me to reach him, to remind him of his human heart." The sound of distant hoofbeats echoed across the mountainside, growing steadily closer. Henrik grabbed his old hunting rifle from beside the door, though they all knew it would be useless against 7 determined hunters. "There's only one way to protect everyone," Kyle said, his voice taking on that strange, layered quality again. "I have to let go completely. Stop fighting what I'm becoming." "No." Elara gripped his arm, her fingers barely able to circle his thin wrist. "There has to be another way. You're just a child." Kyle smiled then, and for a moment he looked exactly like the lost boy they'd taken in, vulnerable and young and entirely human. "I haven't been a child for a very long time, Elara. I just forgot that until I found you both. You reminded me what family feels like." The hoofbeats were louder now, accompanied by the baying of hunting dogs. The wolf rose to his feet, his hackles raised, ready to defend his unlikely pack. "When I change," Kyle continued, his form already beginning to shimmer at the edges like heat waves, "promise me something. Remember that everything I do is to protect you, even if it looks frightening, even if I seem lost." "Kyle," Henrik started, but the boy was already moving away from them, toward the edge of the clearing. "Thank you," he called back, his voice carrying on the wind, "for showing me that monsters can choose to be human, and humans can choose to be heroes." As the first of the hunters crested the ridge, their weapons glinting in the morning sun, Kyle stepped into a shaft of sunlight filtering through the pine trees. The light seemed to embrace him, and his small human form began to blur and expand. The transformation had begun, and with it the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the mountain and everyone who called it home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountain meadow, where 3 figures sat in comfortable silence. Magnus and Elara flanked the boy they had come to know as Kieran, though they suspected that name was as fluid as everything else about him. The massive wolf that had terrorized their valley lay peacefully nearby, its silver coat gleaming in the golden light, eyes now holding wisdom rather than wild fury. Kieran's transformation back to human form had been gradual this time, a deliberate choice rather than the violent shifts they had witnessed before. His skin still held traces of the other world, a slight luminescence that caught the light, fingernails that remained sharp as claws, and eyes that held depths no human gaze should possess. "The pack will come for me soon," he said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the mountain itself. "They've been patient, but patience has limits, even among my kind." Magnus adjusted his weathered hands on his walking stick, the same one he had wielded as a weapon just days before. "You could stay. We could find a way." A smile touched Kieran's lips, ancient and sad. "You would shelter a creature that nearly destroyed everything you've built here, that brought death to your doorstep?" Elara reached over and placed her hand on his arm. Where her fingers touched, the otherworldly glow seemed to dim, as if her humanity could anchor him to this form. "You saved us. You chose to save us." "I chose many things," Kieran replied, his gaze distant. "Some choices echo longer than others." The great wolf lifted its head, ears pricking forward. A low rumble emerged from its throat, not threatening but communicative. Kieran's head tilted in response, and for a moment his features shifted slightly, wolf-like hearing picking up sounds beyond human range. "They're coming," he confirmed. "3 days, maybe 4. They'll want to know why I interfered, why I chose human bonds over pack law." Magnus felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same hollow feeling that had plagued him since their children had grown and moved to distant cities. "And what will you tell them?" Kieran was quiet for so long that Ilara began to worry he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of revelation. "I'll tell them I remembered what it was like to have a home." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. The boy who was not a boy, who commanded storms and spoke with wolves, who could tear apart armies or rebuild broken hearts. He had found something among these mountains that his wild nature had forgotten. "The cottage will need repairs," Ilara said practically, though her voice trembled slightly. "The roof where the lightning struck, the garden that got trampled. Winter's coming, and there's much to do." It was an invitation wrapped in necessity, an offering of purpose and place. Kieran's smile broadened, and for a moment he looked entirely human, young and grateful and slightly overwhelmed. "I've never repaired a roof before." "We'll teach you," Magnus said gruffly. "Though I suspect you'll have your own methods." The great wolf rose and padded over to them, its massive head lowering to rest briefly against Kieran's shoulder. The gesture was tender, almost ceremonial, and when the wolf stepped back, something had changed in its eyes. A wildness returning, a distance growing. "She understands," Kieran murmured. "The choice I'm making—" Ilara watched as the magnificent creature turned toward the deep forest, pausing only once to look back. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows between the trees, as if it had never been more than a dream. "Will you miss it?" she asked. "The wildness, the freedom?" Kieran considered this, flexing his fingers and watching the claws retract fully for the first time since his arrival. "I thought freedom meant having no bonds, no ties to hold me down, but maybe true freedom is choosing which bonds matter enough to keep." Magnus stood slowly, joints protesting the movement. "Come then, let's get started on that roof before the weather turns. Winter comes fast in these mountains." As they walked back toward the cottage, Ilara noticed how Kieran's footsteps had changed. They no longer left the deep impressions of something not quite natural, but pressed into the earth with the solid weight of belonging. Behind them, the mountain meadow emptied of all but wind and sunlight. But in the distance, barely visible through the trees, eyes watched their retreat, curious, concerned, and patient. The pack would wait, as promised. They would listen when the time came, and perhaps if the bonds Kieran had chosen proved strong enough, they would understand. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and possibility as 3 unlikely companions began the work of building a life together, one careful choice at a time.